Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the second episode talking about Reza Aslan's Believer, found on CNN. The series wrapped up, and I've seen them all. I just haven't had a chance to actually do a second episode of this, so I'm going to try and do one or two this week. It's a six-part series, so I suppose you could say will be a third done when we look at this review. I wanted to talk about episode 2 of Believer by Reza Aslan, as it really does hit a bit of a chord for me. In this episode, really what happens is Aslan goes to visit a cult, a doomsday cult, as it turns out. That's found in Hawaii. And the reason why this strikes such a bit of a chord for me is that you could say, to an extent, that I also am a bit of a cult creator, cult follower, in that I've developed a system of spirituality which doesn't fit within the traditional norms. It's a religious system that could be considered strange by some outside the mainstream, certainly, which is really part of the definition of what a cult is. A cult is really a religious system that just hasn't hit the mainstream yet. We often use it in reference to those organizations like David Koresh, Jim Jones, etc., the Kool-Aid drinking, suicide, undertaking, ball snipping, following a UFO behind a comet way. And in fact, all of those examples are actually shown in Reza Aslan's second episode of examples of traditional concepts of what a cult is. And typically they end in disaster. Typically they're led by absolute crazy fanatics who end up killing themselves or killing others. But what I appreciated about Aslan's this episode, is, as we'll go through it, is that it gives a much more, it gives something to think about in terms of what a cult actually is and what a religious system is and what personal religious practice should actually look like. Because it's a barrier that I've often faced in my startup community, the wandering priests, and my own my own little hole within that, known as the Pallium Society. So to begin, this episode starts off. This doomsday cult happens to be in Hawaii. Doesn't Reza Aslan get all the choice assignments, right? Get to go to Hawaii, and apparently Hawaii, and I didn't know this about Hawaii, although it really doesn't surprise me all that much, is the home to a lot of New Age spirituality and religious communities. There's actually a few newer spiritual communities on this island, but this one is picked in particular, I think, probably because it has a few criteria. The location of this place, or the name of this cult compound, quote unquote, is Cinderland, and is run by a prophet known as Jesus with a Z, Jezus. And as part of this episode, Aslan really comes out and he he goes to, looks like a roadside food stand, and talks to some of the locals that are around this compound. And it's interesting to see the opinions of some of the people that are there. It's clear that this fellow has made a bit of a splash in the local community because they all seem to know about him. Some are quite skeptical. Others maybe started off skeptical, but tend to be a little bit more sympathetic to what he's actually doing, what he's actually looking like. So that was kind of an interesting piece in all of this. Some think he's crazy. Some are a little bit more sympathetic to what he has to say. And just from talking, going through the initial first few minutes of this episode, it's clear that one of the common features that this Jesus has, that is common to a lot of cult leaders, I think, is the idea of the charismatic sort of leadership. That they do offer, really, leadership skills in a particular direction. Leadership being defined as the art of influencing human behavior in the manner desired by the leader. And you have to be a leader in order to found a successful cult, I would say. It's something that would be required, because if nobody, you may have a personal religious system, but if your goal is really to get a whole pile of people to follow your way of life, you have to have innate leadership skills. So It's clear that this guy has it, and he has founded a cult. It is a doomsday cult, meaning they believe the end of the world is coming, etc. And Aslan really tackles the idea of cults in society, and it's you know again, one of the criticisms that Aslan gets throughout this series is that he makes the non-mainstream appear to be acceptable to the mainstream, which is why he gets so much feedback, so much pushback from a lot of others. And I've since the last episode, I've read even more really negative press about what Aslan's doing. But again, I have to say I applaud what he's doing with this because, particularly on the topic of religion, the idea of straying from the mainstream is something that you really have to fight against if you're not part of the mainstream. Because people have a particular idea that a religion and a spirituality has to fall within particular camps that are already predefined. When in fact, every religion on this planet started with 1 or 2 or 12 people who had a common idea of spirituality and grew from there. Every religion started off as a cult. Christianity did. You could argue Judaism did. We don't have a lot of the historic record, but we do have some notion of Judaism starting from some Sumerian tablets, which speak of the Eabru and this crazy ass yokel named Ibrahim in the wandering around the desert with this crew, which is the start of Judaism, in terms of a historical context. So every religion starts off as a cult. It's a religious system that people think is weird or strange or doesn't fit into the mainstream. And Aslan really tries to normalize that a little bit, which is something that I appreciate because I think the more and more that the world is starting to see the breakdown of traditional religious systems, Christianity, etc., and the growth and development of more individualized or smaller group religions taking hold, we have to come to grips with our prejudices when it comes to religion and spirituality, that it's not necessarily all going to be mainstream. But that's not a bad thing. We've broken down those barriers in other areas of our culture, other social structures of our culture, different forms of government, different forms of community, different forms of familial relationships, that break away from the mainstream. Those battles have been, they have been fought. They are being fought in some cases, but they've gained foothold and significant ground, if nothing else. And what Aslan is doing, I think, with this, especially highlighting a cult in the second episode, is really saying that battle needs to be fought also in terms of religion. And we'll talk a little bit more about how I got to that, because he goes on a bit of he describes his personal thesis in regards to religion at the end of this episode and explains so much as to why he is looking at religion, these these lesser known, widely perceived strange religions as part of the series. Aslan begins really by showing a few things. He shows the community, he shows the buildings, he shows where people live, he shows sort of the daily life of these people, where they get their food, where they store it, how the living arrangements are set, and he shows the people. And one of the big features of this is that he shows that people aren't trapped. There's no cage, and in fact, people come and go. People who live in the cult compound may not actually even be followers of this cult, but they found a place where they can sort of stop and do some personal spiritual discernment. Or others leave the cult and go and work to earn money for the community. So again, this is breaking down that traditional discrimination against cults as being locked in. Nobody leaves. Everybody's trapped. Everybody can't. Nobody can get out, etc. And in fact, showing it that it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, you can actually have a new religious movement, which is the more academic term for a cult, which is not based on trapping people into a particular geographical area or community or way of living, really. It can be open, It can allow for the individual to really come and go and to flourish. And so that's something that I found really interesting. The followers seem to be one of the common themes that comes out, and I found it really interesting. Whether they are diehard followers of this prophet Jesus with a Z, or whether they are just passers through, the common thing for people that are in this community seems to be that they're tired of the modernity or even the post-modernity. And they start asking themselves, what am I living for? So some of the people that were interviewed were successful in the world, and some had really crappy relationships and life circumstances close to suicide, angst about the world, and really this place has served as a bit of a magnet for some people to spirituality, that the material world in and of itself didn't live up to the promise of materialism. Let's hit the nail on the head. That in fact it didn't satisfy the soul in the way that so many materialists, philosophical materialists, really want to paint the world. That people that were living in that world, ignoring spirituality and only concentrating on the material world around them, on their work, on the things that make them happy, were miserable. And they turned to a simpler life, which is definitely what this place seems to be, and also one that leaves room for the spiritual. May not have a lot of spiritual dogma to it, and it doesn't appear actually that there is a lot of spiritual dogma to this community. It's sort of united around a person who has an idea and a way of going forward, rather than tracts and tracts of dogma and that sort of thing that people can adjust to. So the setup to this is really important. I encourage everybody to take a look at this, because it's actually I think it does a service to the world to show people that you can have a new religious movement. And yeah, it appear a little weird and strange, but you know what? It doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be sinister. It doesn't have to be the Kool-Aid drinking, ball snipping cults that we were introduced to from Jonestown up through David Koresh, up through the the Hale Bob community. I don't remember their names. And other cultish sort of communities that, particularly in the 90s, really were smashed. So as we go through this, part of the ritual is that this Jesus character, without being introduced to him, through his followers, makes Reza Aslan go through sort of an initiation, a trial of sleeping in a cave before he can see him. And Reza, of course, does his the academic analysis of this, which is the cave, the mystery, which is common in many religious traditions. The cave is deemed to be a place of mystery where you go in and come out. It's a place where you receive sort of a spiritual revelation or a spiritual growth and then come back out into the world. And I won't spoil it how this ends up going, but it's interesting that he goes through this trial. He is then introduced eventually to this prophet, Jesus, who is exactly who you would expect. He comes across as a total kook. He's jumping up and down and screaming and speaking in weird intonations. And Reza Aslan, he talks about, how he was freaked out a little bit for 2 hours with this guy's manic behavior. And this Jesus then reveals that the basis of his spiritual community is a prophecy he received where California is going to break off into the ocean and there's going to be massive world flooding. And so it's a doomsday cult. It really is a doomsday cult. What's interesting is that it's not something it's sort of based on a lot of ideas that had come out before. I've actually heard of the California dropping off into the ocean thing long before I ever watched this show. Certainly global warming is deemed by climate change is deemed as a catastrophe by many that's going to lead to an annihilation. So the ground is ripe for environmental catastrophism and the growth of spiritual communities based on that. And Aslan really, he goes out into this community and explores, this ark that they're building, to survive the flood as a community, but really delves into really what's behind it, the individual spirituality and growth that's behind it. And it becomes evident that in the face of catastrophe, in the face of others thinking that these people are crazy just because they're looking from the outside, what is actually being found there, at least apparently, based on the show, is a sense of peace. Is that this Jesus has actually created a community where individuals feel worth, where they feel a sense of spirituality, where they feel a sense that they can be themselves and grow into themselves. And that really is a beautiful thing. I thought it was actually a beautiful experience, and I gotta admit, there was a draw in me to actually check this place out and see what it would be like to live there. I mean, how many of us who get tired of the mundane world look for, an acreage or a farm or a cabin in the woods or whatever in order to get away from it all? And in reality, this is what this community is, with a spiritual twist on it. And some people believe in the catastrophe, other people don't, but that live in this community. But that's not really the point. The point is really about finding that interior peace. And, Aslan has a great discussion towards the end of the episode with this Jesus. And he confronts him, saying, "Listen, dude, I thought you were crazy jumping around." And Jesus says, "Yeah." He says, "You put on a mask, and that I'm, schizophrenic in the way that I approach things." Whether or not he actually means he's schizophrenic, or he's schizophrenic in the way that he approaches, regardless of whether that disease is real or not, it's another rite of passage. If you can survive the jumping up and down and the mania and the crazy ass behavior, if you can get through that, then you are somebody who can actually delve into the spirituality and can grow into the community. And I understand that. It's a rite of passage just like any of the others. It's a little more intensive, no doubt about it. But it's a rite of passage where you demonstrate how serious you actually are in living the lifestyle of the community and following the precepts, and which is really growing individually, working, living within the community, and finding a sense of peace even in the face of chaos. That's what it was all about. And this Jesus really does have that leadership quality because, at least in his appearances, comes off very seriously in terms of feeling a responsibility for others. And it says right out, people here are still searching. That reinforcing that there's not a lot of dogma behind this community, but there is a spiritual basis for which people can grow. And this is the beauty. And a lot of these people come from more than one spiritual background. And this is the beauty of this episode, because it really does highlight that new religious movements, creating a new religion, creating a new religious community, creating a spirituality from your own personal experience and sharing that with others, big or small. And in this case, I think it's actually fairly small. I don't think it's actually, a Joel Osteen sort of a revival meeting. It seems to be very small. It's possible and it can be beautiful. It doesn't have to be crazy or nasty. Yeah, it may be a little odd in some of its practices and some of its beliefs in terms of looking at it from the outside, but there's a beauty and a genuineness to it that you don't find, I'm going to say it, in a lot of the more mainstream and established religious traditions. This is a lived spirituality in a positive way on a daily basis, not something you go to just go to church on Sunday for and forget about. It's real for the longer haul. And that's why I think this episode was really great. So I encourage everybody to check out episode 2 of CNN's Believer. And at the end of it, Aslan really highlights why I think his approach is fantastic and why the mainstream really has such a problem with what he's doing, because they don't get it. They're stuck in a particular mindset of what religion and spirituality should be and who should be included and who shouldn't. It is the 1950s gender relationship. It is the 1950s civil relationship. It is the 1950s familial relationships, which those battles have been fighting and are continuing to be fought, but which have made ground. Now it's time for that religious cultural revolution. And that's what Aslan is doing here. And he says that his view of religion is not about rules. It's not about temples. It's not about all the things that we commonly associate with religion in the world. The monolithic bureaucracy, the buildings, the rules, the dogma, etc., etc. It's about the quest for meaning. And that there's more to life than the material. It's about hope. And it's a way of doing it as a community. Not just the individual. It starts with the individual. It begins with the individual. It lives within the individual. But that those individual senses can be united in a broader spiritual community, which is what religion was supposed to be in the first place, and just really got out of hand with all the rules and all the buildings and all the hierarchies and all the rulers and all how it got entwined in politics, through the Dark Ages on up. That's what religion is. It's about a place where the individual can come out of themselves and live that spiritual experience and then find meaning in the world with themselves, but also with others. Beautiful episode. I encourage everybody to check it out. Aslan seems to be a lot more articulate in terms of what he's trying to say about his own position, obviously, right? But I think you'll also get a sense, if you can get past the word cult, and if you can get past sort of the manic behavior of Jesus in this episode, I think you will find the seedbed of what is actually, Aslan is actually the point he's trying to get to. Not only with this episode, but with the entire series. And I think this episode is actually a linchpin episode in this series to talk about why he's doing what he's doing. Why he is allowing these traditional outsider religions and spiritual communities to have a voice alongside the mainstream. And that's why people are fighting him. Just like people fought about race, just like people fought about gender, just like people fought about traditional family, traditional sexuality, etc., etc., etc. This is the new battleground, religion and spirituality. All right, everybody, take care. Leave a comment.